Have you ever wondered what daily life is like for a soldier on the front lines of an unrelenting war? In this video, we'll show how the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade faces constant attacks in Kharkiv, one of the most affected regions by the conflict. Exclusive footage, scenes of courage, rescues, and the sacrifice of a paramedic who gave his life trying to save his comrades. Don't miss the chance to see the war like never before, straight from the battlefield. Get ready for a journey that will challenge your perception of reality. What you are about to see contains real war footage from the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It is presented strictly for documentary purposes. We do not encourage violence. Recommended for 18+. In the forests and trenches of the Kharkiv region, the war unfolds in a constant and relentless manner. This video documents the experience of the soldiers of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade who are on the front lines facing enemy attacks. The Kharkiv region, located in northeastern Ukraine, has been one of the main battlefields since the start of the Russian invasion in 2022. The city of Kharkiv, the second largest in the country, has faced intense artillery attacks and airstrikes, being a strategic target due to its proximity to Russia and its industrial and logistical importance. The 3rd Separate Assault Brigade of Ukraine, formerly known as the Azov Regiment, has undergone significant transformations since its establishment. Originally formed in 2014 as a volunteer unit to combat insurgency in eastern Ukraine, the Azov Regiment evolved over time. In January 2023, it was reorganized into the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, a mechanized infantry unit highly mobile, well-armed, and trained for both defensive and offensive operations. Some of the footage captured here was made by Fox's camera, a paramedic who, while trying to save his comrades, lost his life on the battlefield. This is an honest account of how the war is lived in the daily lives of those who risk everything to defend their positions. Amid the chaos, paramedics play a crucial role. Fox, capturing moments of treating the wounded under enemy fire, portrayed the urgency of war. Over the months of conflict, Ukrainian forces have managed to resist Russian advances and in some areas even reclaim territories. However, the city and its surrounding areas continue to be an unforgiving battleground, with soldiers facing close-range attacks, sieges, and constant bombings. The region has been marked by a war of attrition, with the civilian population also suffering, but at the same time demonstrating remarkable resilience and resistance in the face of destruction and chaos. Before each mission, the atmosphere in the trenches is filled with tension and preparation. Soldiers from the 2nd Mechanized Battalion and the 1st Assault Battalion review equipment, position themselves, and prepare to enter combat. For some, it's their first time facing enemy fire, while others are already accustomed to the intensity of war. The firing of RPGs, quick grenade loading, and care with each movement become part of the daily routine. The tension is constant, but the experience of the fighters makes each action more precise.
Один пішов, як прийняв. Одна пішла, як прийняв.
Що там?
Зараз чекати. Да.
Я скручував лічно.
On the battlefields, the trenches become the central locations for violent confrontations. The war of positions, with constant attacks on enemy positions, creates a scene of explosions, smoke, and quick decisions. Every move is calculated, as the lives of the soldiers depend on speed and precision. The 3rd Assault Brigade is highly mobile, combining mechanized infantry and artillery support to dominate the battlefield. Among its most effective weapons are mortars, used to suppress enemy positions and clear the way for infantry advances. The unit operates various models, such as the M120-15 Mollet and the 2B11 Sani. Both the M120-15 Mollet and the 2B11 Sani are 120mm mortars used for long-range attacks, reaching up to 7.1 kilometers. For greater mobility, they employ 82mm mortars, such as the 2B9 Vasilek and the BM37, which is lightweight and effective in dynamic combat. These mortars utilize 82mm ammunition. The 3rd Separate Assault Brigade includes specialized units such as the 2nd Mechanized Battalion and the 1st Assault Battalion. The 2nd Mechanized Battalion is specialized in the use of armored vehicles, providing mobility and combat power across diverse terrains. Since July 2023, the battalion has been commanded by VAR, who, since the beginning of the full-scale war, has served as a grenade launcher operator, squad commander, and platoon commander in the SSO Azov Special Forces. The 1st Assault Battalion, on the other hand, focuses on direct, high-risk operations aimed at destroying specific enemy targets and seizing strategic positions. These units have played significant roles in recent confrontations, including the Battle of Bakhmut, contributing to the resistance and defense of Ukrainian territory. The battalion commander is Foka, who began his combat path as a machine gunner in the Azov Regiment in 2015. On February 24, 2022, he joined TRO Azov Kiev, where he progressed through all service levels, from soldier to battalion commander of the 3rd Assault Brigade.
Но я этого, который по правой шел перед математиком, его съебал гранатой F-кой. Курим. Ошалеть, бля. Ай-яй-яй. Я вообще нахуй пизда, бля.
По дальності нормально, лівіше треба дати. То, да. Алігатор готовий.
At close range, soldiers face off, attempting to advance or defend their positions. Danger is a constant, and every victory on the battlefield comes with the risk of being hit.
Одна пішла, як прийняв.
Плюс-плюс. Очікуємо. Плюс-плюс, передам. Аргентина, що готова,
Ну, туди саме.
Аргентина, залишайтесь, десь на стройках, прийміть укриття. Плюс-плюс. Одна півкола.
Ближче, блядь. Братан, ти перебирати додати. Ось є. Угу.
Сука, пизда моему рюкзаку, блядь.
Чувак, там де ми були.
Там, где мы только что были?
Да. Ну да, він майже завалився.
Похуй. Голова начала болеть, нам рука сильно. Не знаю. Рука валять. Не успокаивайся. Море, я Фокс на прием. Хуёво пизда.
На зв'язку прийом.
Математик, легка контузія. Вот такие там, не, харьковские лесы. Да. Мы вас приветствуем. Бомба. Врывайся от эти штурмовую, дрон.
Moreover, war demands precision at every moment. When an enemy drone is spotted, the response is immediate. Soldiers prepare their weapons and position themselves to try to counter it.
Ушла вниз под звук. Вторых заебашил, бачишь? Ага. Сука, ёбан. Ну, боженька, да? Оп. Сука. Все, улетело.
Машина.
Машину. Давай шаг, говорю, блядь.
Не розрив.
Побігли, блядь.
Paramedics not only care for the victims, but also face the risk of being hit while trying to save lives. Soldier Fox was one of these figures, sacrificing his own life to try to rescue a wounded comrade. His loss reflects the value and sacrifice of all those who risk their lives to save others in extreme conditions. This video is not limited to showing combat footage. It serves as a portrait of the experience of the soldiers of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade. Heroism in war goes beyond political choices. It lies in the fight for life and the protection of those beside you. If you liked the video, then leave a like now